Good morning. Hello, everyone. Happy Earth Week, wherever you're joining us from, and welcome. Thanks for joining us for our deep dive session this morning on Parity for the Planet and Women Changemakers in Conservation. I'm Sharon Ryan, and today we're going to be talking with an amazing, diverse group of leaders from all around the world. And these guys are changing cultures, they're creating communities, and they're making sure that women's voices, diverse voices, are at the table where the decisions about conservation get made. I'm the founder of the Luneer Collective, and I help women who are ready to step into their full potential as leaders through professional development programs and peer coaching. And I'm joined by my co-moderator today, who's Elaine Millen, who's a great executive coach and leader. And Elaine will be helping to field your questions from our attendees, and we'll get to those questions a little bit later in the hour with our panelists. And so right now, I'd just like to do a quick round of introductions so you can meet everybody on our panel. And we'll ask them to say a little bit about themselves and tell you about the work that really lights them up. Could we start with you, Leela? Would that be okay?
Sure. Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be joining you from Kenya. I'm Leela Hazza. I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of Lion Guardians. It's a community-based organization in southern Kenya, which works to empower communities and engage them in conservation. So we're all about developing, implementing, and sharing innovative conservation solutions that are culturally appropriate, but also sustainable. So I'm also a founding member of Pride Lion Conservation Alliance and Women for the Environment Africa, or We Africa. And we'll talk a little bit more about those initiatives today, I hope. So happy to be here.
Great, thank you. Purnima, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. Yeah, I am Namaskar from Assam, and I am Purnima Devi Barman, and I am a wildlife biologist in Aaranyak in Assam. It's an NGO, and I have been working with communities, more than 10,000 people, to save a bird, an endangered bird called greater adjutant stork, locally called hargila. You can see the bird in my dress. Made by my women group. Yeah, maybe, just, yeah. So this bird, can you believe this bird was treated as bad omen in Assam? This is locally called as hargila. Hargila means bone swallowers. They are scavenger bird, and because they are scavenger and they were treated as messy bird, bad omen, and we needed to work a lot with communities to change the image of this bird. And our work is blending of community conservation, research, and then livelihood, women empowerment, and spirituality, and bringing the tradition. So, and I'm so honored to be here. Thanks a lot to Optimism. Thanks a lot, Sharon, and thanks a lot to Jesse. That's all about our work.
Great, thank you for joining us this morning. Chanté, can you tell us a little bit about you and the work that you're doing?
Sure, happy to, and really, really excited to be here. So my name is Chanté Coleman. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm based in Annapolis, Maryland. I'm the first ever Director of Equity and Justice for the National Wildlife Federation, or NWF. NWF is an over 80-year-old conservation organization focusing on healthy people and communities and healthy wildlife. And we know that as an organization, in order to be successful, we need to make sure that our work is benefiting the people who need it the most. And in reality, our work is becoming harder and harder as our country is growing further apart, and we really need to start bringing people together. We know women are not represented in top leadership positions. We know that our organization doesn't reflect the demographics of our country, and we have to be relevant and really work with the communities that we're supporting. So my job at my organization is to do this. So I work to operationalize equity and embed equity and justice into all of our organizational practices and policies and programs, so that NWF becomes a place that really celebrates people from all walks of life. I'm also on the steering committee, super excited, of the Women in Conservation Leadership Program. It's a gender equity program that was founded by the National Wildlife Federation, and Whitney is actually one of our advisory council co-chairs. So it's one of the most exciting parts of my job. It's a real great example of how we promote gender equity and really uplift and empower women in conservation. So thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, great, wonderful. We're looking forward to hearing more about that. Whitney, how about you?
Yes, thank you again so much for putting this incredible panel of women together. I'm delighted. So again, I'm Whitney Tome, the Executive Director of Green 2.0. And Green 2.0 was founded on the premise that the conservation movement, at least in the United States, needed to increase its racial diversity. And so Green 2.0 was the first organization to really document how many people of color were in the movement across at least the United States, and the recognition that we were only between 12 and 16% of the staff in those organizations, both foundations, NGOs, and the government. And our goal has then been to push the movement to really increase its racial diversity. So through scorecards and reports on different topics, we really are seeking to hold the movement accountable to including more people of color across all sections of the organization. So everything from the staff and interns straight up to the board. So we as an institution will continue to push that and are looking forward to really seeing people of color in the seats of power to make the crucial decisions on allocation of resources, but also the policies that we hope to see in the world.
Great, wow, some incredible work going on there. Elaine, would you like to say a couple of words about your work?
Oh, me, you're asking me. Yes, I feel really privileged to be here to help Sharon today in moderating the panel. And my work is pretty broad, but it's primarily about leadership for women and men. And I've spent about 20 years in the corporate world at Honeywell, serving as executive in organizational leadership. And I've also had two nonprofits that have been very successful. One in Kenya, empowering women in all 8 different villages over the last 10 years. And I also have a nonprofit called Graceful Passages that really is about helping people in transition. And I'm very honored that Sharon invited me to be part of this. And I'm just in awe of all of you panelists who are doing amazing, amazing work for women. Fills my heart.
Well, we're honored to have you, Elaine. And last but not least, Jessie Deichmann. Jessie, it was my co-organizer for this event. She's been on the ground with this since day one. So Jessie, would you like to, and I should also say that Jessie also co-founded an organization called Women in Nature Network, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. Jessie, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Sharon. Thanks, everybody. As Sharon mentioned, I'm Jessica Dyckman. Jessie, please. I'm a conservation biologist at the Smithsonian, and I'm also a founding member of the Women in Nature Network, or WIN, as Sharon mentioned. I'm also a daughter and a sister and a cousin and a friend and a wife and a mother of almost 2, like a lot of you out there. At the Smithsonian, my research looks for ways to minimize the impacts of infrastructure development on wildlife and really high biodiversity habitats. And then with WIN, I'm part of this global network seeking to build connections between women across the world to enhance their abilities to manage natural resources and protect the environment. So we're working to develop a global learning community of women in order to create and support conservation efforts across the planet. And I will talk more about that in a little bit.
Great, well, thank you all. Leela, I'd like to bring it back to you. The themes of community and peer support seem to run through all that you do. So the Pride Alliance, as you mentioned, was founded by you and 5 other women who are working in lion conservation across Africa. And you're also the founding member of Women for the Environment in Africa. So tell us a little bit about the work of these 2 organizations and why you think that community is so essential for women who work in this field. What are some of the benefits of peer networks for women leaders in this space?
Cool, thanks, Sharon. Maybe I'll just give you a little background about myself. So I've been working in the African conservation space for over 20 years now, and spend most of that time in a tent in the bush, founding and running an NGO, working mostly with men. So this has all given me a lot of experience, both good and bad, in terms of how leadership in our sector is done and what we can do to improve things. So I guess my hope for the future is very much tied to women moving into this leadership space. So I'll share a couple of examples, and I'm glad that you brought up Pride and We Africa, because they're really moving us toward this joint vision of change that we all really want. So first, Pride Lion Conservation Alliance, it started 5 years ago, again with 6 women, and we were all running some of the most impactful lion conservation organizations on the continent. So we decided to come together under a collaborative umbrella, because we knew that if we could come together, we would have much greater impact than if we kept going individually. And things started getting pretty nasty in the conservation space, right? Competition, all these nasty things that happen. And with single species conservation, and the more prolific the animal is, the nastier things get, right? So, and during this time when we started coming together, people kept saying, it wouldn't work. We would fight over money, prestige, but those skeptics couldn't be more wrong. Our communal desire to conserve lions and work with communities drove the process. Our financial meetings take 5 minutes. And I think values like trust, integrity, recognition, and appreciation for each other's strength has made this alliance a big success. And I think personally, the thing that has meant so much to me being part of Pride is the peer support. So both professionally and personally, I think, I feel that I can share anything with these 5 women because they understand me and they understand the things that we go through living in these remote sites and dealing with, vast challenges that happen like every single day. So their support makes me a much more resilient leader, I would say, every day. I was just on the phone before I got on this call with 2 Pride members to talk about other things that are going on right now in Kenya. So we're always in contact, and that's the thing. Our WhatsApp group, it doesn't make a difference where we are. We're always together. So the second initiative is We Africa, Women for the Environment Africa. So it's all about creating an alliance of effective women environmental leaders who will collaborate to empower themselves and others. And ultimately, for us, it's really about restoring that gender imbalance within leadership and having bigger impacts on the ground, because we're tired of watching species just decline over and over again. So, We Africa has 3 main parts. We do a 4-day training for senior level conservation women, and we actually just did our first one this past February. We put out a call, we got 500 applications from across Africa. We only had 30 spots to fill. So, it was such high demand. We had Margaret Kenyatta, the First Lady in Kenya, come and talk about this initiative and the work we were doing. So, it was really wonderful to see. And the other thing we're doing as We Africa is we have a 12-month kind of transformative leadership experience for women at the C-suite or executive levels that's much more customizable. But underpinning the entire experience is a strong network and sense of community. And I think it's something we've realized that is so critically important for women in leadership in Africa, because less than 5% of conservation leadership positions on the continent are filled by women. So it's currently a really lonely space. We're already living in a remote place, but now there's just a couple of us. So I don't think that we should spend time convincing people that women's leadership matters or we're good leaders. And just so, we can look at the current situation, which has shown us that female leaders across the globe are performing better than men against the coronavirus, right? So we need to change the current system so more women in leadership is the de facto norm. And both Pride and We Africa are contributing to this much needed movement. So I just want to end with my good friend Colleen Begg, who's also a founding member of Pride and We Africa. She always says, she says that if it doesn't create discomfort, then it is unlikely change. So I think that's something that we can all remember, as we work towards shifting these conservation norms.
Yeah, thank you. We have to get comfortable in the discomfort, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Purnima, we hear calls, as Leela is saying, for more women and diversity in leadership roles these days across all sectors. I think, though, there's a particularly compelling case for bringing more women into conservation decision-making. Women, particularly women of color and women experiencing poverty around the world, are likely to be more impacted by environmental issues like climate change, for example, than men. So in fact, UN figures indicate that 80% of people displaced by climate change are women. In India, you're working with hundreds of women, your army, as you call them, in the fight to preserve the greater adjutant stork. Why is it so important for women to be involved in planning, policy, and decision-making in wildlife conservation? Excuse me.
Thanks a lot, Sharon. It's such a strong question. And first of all, I'd like to just mention that a woman has a motherly, instinct. A woman is a nurturer. She is a creator. She, in the role of, in the role of a sister, a daughter-in-law, in every form of life, she can create a big difference. She is so powerful. If we can nurture our child, if we can, take care of our home in such a way, so I think we are very powerful. And I, in my life, had to struggle a lot. It's really a male-dominated society. I struggle a lot, but I got inner strength from that. And then again, regarding to your question, I would like to again take my work's example. I'm very honored to speak about our Hargila Army women. We have a band of rural women, 400 rural women in our conservation. I formed this group called Hargila Army. Hargila is the name of the bird, locally called Hargila. As I told you that Hargila was treated as bad omen, is a disease-carrying bird. So now our women are very proud to get the identity of being Hargila Army. They are so proud. If you go to the village, every woman will represent the bird. They are the protector of the bird and the trees. So here I'd like to mention that it is so important to involve women in conservation agenda. No conservation will be successful if we exclude women. It is so important, not only in the, among the in the intellectual it is very important. As I have been working with rural women, I need to emphasize here that it is so important to involve the rural women, because in here, taking again our example here, we have enormous biodiversity in protected area, but at the same time we have lots of biodiversity, enormous biodiversity in the unprotected area in the villages. And women are the key player. They are emotionally connected with nature, and our Hargila Army is an example. Like when I worked for this species to change the attitude of the bird, to make it as fancy as the other species, other mega species. The idea came to my mind that we have to bring this bird into the tradition, into the society of the people in the villages, and women could make a big difference. For example, now this bird is a part of ritual festival. We we could see this. You could see this, that I am wearing this traditional dress. This bird took place, and the Hargila is a part of the tradition. And women, this is because of the women. And again, many people ask us that do you work only with women? No, not at all. We have picked up one woman from every household. It means one woman and her family, her husband, her children, and her neighborhood, because a woman have a big range of influence, not only in our home and everywhere. So we have been working with more than 10,000 families, and I would like to tell more about in the upcoming discussion about our Hargila Army women. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you. From what you and Leela have been talking about, it's clear that women bring a lot of strengths to conservation and different kinds of skills that make for effective leaders in this space. Jessie, I'd like to turn now to you. According to the World Economic Forum, it'll take up to 208 years to achieve gender equality in the United States. Okay, I think we can all agree that that's pretty messed up. As a biologist, what are some of the barriers and biases you see facing women as they move up the ladder in conservation science? And how can we help break through some of these barriers and accelerate progress when it comes to getting more women into leadership roles in science?
Well, thanks, Sharon. I think that that's a great question. It's a question that all field biologists who are women are wondering about on a daily basis. And I think that one of the major barriers, whether people realize it or not, or one of the major challenges, is the fact that women, and not just field biologists, but women in general, have to do more to accomplish the same thing as male counterparts. You know, here's the example of the woman field biologist. When you are a woman, particularly from one culture, who goes to work in another culture, and I know this area pretty well because I'm from the US and I work a lot in Central and South America. We need to rely really heavily on all of our skills, like our mediation skills, our humility, our subtlety, a lot of the skills that Leela and Purnima already pointed out. We need to learn how to lead through other people, because we can't just walk into another culture that has ideas about the differences between men and women with an attitude that says, in my country, women are supposedly equal, so I should be equal here too. A man, on the other hand, can walk into most cultures where generally men are recognized as the ones who should be leading, you know, at least in principle, at least, you know, at least in the vision of most people. But women have to use a lot of different methods depending on the situation to garner support and to move projects forward. So I think that the fact that that isn't widely recognized is a major barrier and a challenge. I recently read a study about trying to prove whether or not that conception that women are better multitaskers than men was true. And it showed that through a variety of tests, women are not necessarily better multitaskers. In fact, women and men are just as bad at multitasking, because multitasking is not a thing that our brains are meant to do. It's just that women do more work or have to do more work to achieve the same thing. So I think just recognition of that would be a great a barrier to let down. Another barrier that pops up is one that's particularly relevant to me in my life right now, because I have a young child and I'm about to have a second young child. And so the maternal wall, the idea or the conception that it's impossible to be a good worker and be a good mother is really hard to deal with. And it's changing slowly, but there are so many institutional barriers in place that promote the maternal wall. You know, when I go to the field, people ask me, well, who's taking care of your daughter? No one asks my male colleagues who is taking care of their kids when we go to the field. So those, I think, are some of the big challenges.
Great. And do you have some thoughts around what we could do to overcome some of those? Yeah,
I mean, these are things, these are not novel ideas. These are things that people have said for many, 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 many years now. We need policies in place for both sexes that value families, that guarantee work leave and accommodations to take care of family members, policies that don't disadvantage parents who may disappear from the workplace for a short time to take care of small children, paid parental leave, childcare support for travel. Again, there are multiple studies out there that are really daunting to someone like me who has one child and is about to have a second, that say a professional woman can have one child, but having a second one is like career suicide, right? I'm sure lots of you have seen these papers. But then of course I look at people like Purnima and Sharon, who this is not true for. So that and other women in my WIN group give me lots of strength and courage to press on. But yeah, we really need this kind of support institutionally. And then outside our own organizations, I think that we need to put in place better mentorship and networking organizations. And that's exactly what WIN does. You know, WIN, we set up WIN so that women can provide support to other women working in conservation and natural resource management. And it's not necessarily just for women in positions of leadership. We are working with women who are leading grassroots efforts in local communities, and also with women who are at the top of huge conservation organizations like the Mexican Fund for the Conservation of Nature. So bringing women together, creating those support networks and mentorship networks is really key.
Thank you. It sounds like you're also providing resources. And I know you guys are funding programs, conservation programs, and helping out in some of those areas as well, which is really important too, right? Access to resources to get the work done. Yeah. Chanté, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions now, if I may. We know that many of the biases that perpetuate inequality in organizations, they're largely unconscious and automatic. So I'm wondering, how do we shift an organization's cultural paradigm from one that's, let's say, of tokenism, where we make some gender and diversity hires and we're done, we're good, to one where equity, diversity, and inclusion are deeply embedded in the culture? And if you could start by helping us understand some of these terms, because they get batted around a lot. If you could walk us through some of those terms, what you think they mean, and then talk a little bit about how you get an organization or the entire organization, including the leadership team, on board with these initiatives.
Okay, and how much time do I have? Under 3 minutes to answer all of that. Organizational change, define all the terms. We've been spending about 3 years doing everything that you just asked, but I will try to whittle it down a little bit. So I believe one of the things that you're getting at in your question is the difference between diversity and inclusion. So we often hear terms like DEIJ or JEDI to talk about these concepts that they're really interrelated, but they're separate and distinct. In the beginning, the environmental movement was really focused on diversity. And when we lead with diversity, that can lead to tokenization because we're just focusing on sheer numbers. And instead, we need to really be considering the actual inequities that are happening like internally at our organizations, which is why women are not in the most powerful positions in leadership, or the reasons why we're recruiting people of color, but we're unable to retain those people within our movement. So I have just a super quick story to highlight what I mean. A few years ago, the leadership team at NWF, where I work, was meeting at an undisclosed location. I'm not sure where they were meeting. I think they were meeting in like Arizona or something. And on the agenda at the time was DEIJ, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice. And I was helped leading this work. And it was elevated to our executive leadership that it appeared that everyone who was invited to the meeting was white, although on the agenda they were talking about diversity, equity, inclusion. And so it was suggested to our senior leadership that I be invited to the meeting for diverse representation and to have someone else around the table. And I received the invite after everyone else received the invite. And I felt like I was being tokenized. So I phoned a friend, Whitney. I don't know if you remember receiving this phone call from me, but I called Whitney and she told me that in order to not be tokenized, I needed a purpose and a role in the meeting and to be set up for success. And it was like the Friday before the meeting was happening, that Monday, and the entire agenda, including the portion on equity and justice, was planned without any of my knowledge and any of my input. And so I went back to the VP that invited me and I said, I can't attend this meeting because I don't want to be tokenized. And I explained to her why. And this sort of was a catalyst to a lot of change at our organization, but rebuilding our leadership team to reflect more of the diversity of our organization. And we really were intentional about how we set that table to think about who we needed around the table, including women and people of color, to move our organizational priorities forward in the organization. So these like little cultural shifts and choice points that we face to make equitable decisions are really about shifting power. So we rebuilt our leadership team to shift power. We also have an equity and justice steering committee that our CEO put power and authority in that committee. So we shifted some power there. So getting our CEO and our executive team and leadership in a place where they're willing to shift power is where the rubber meets the road. That's a little bit tougher to do. And it's a personal journey for each of them. Everyone has to do the work around this to understand equity, to understand why it's critical to our success, why our current culture has to change, and that they can actually do something about it. So it's taken time, taken a lot of learning. It's taken saying the same thing 15 different times, 20 different ways, but everyone's really starting to catch on in my organization. And it's been really intentional. And I just want to emphasize intentionality. So I mentioned that I'm on the steering committee of Women in Conservation Leadership. We were not as intentional as we could have been about setting the table of women who were planning and driving this initiative forward in the beginning. This led to a group of white women who I love and adore and who are amazing, planning a space that was very inclusive of other white women, but not as inclusive of all the women that we wanted to see and participate in that space. And so as we look at conservation leadership, we see that women are not in the most powerful positions, but there's even a larger gap for women of color that we have to really pay attention to. So our women's movements, in my mind, must really account for intersectionality of gender as well as other identities. So now we've really taken that into account and been intentional about how we're looking at WCL Women in Conservation Leadership. So our advisory council is now over half women of color. Our steering committee has more representation. We favor content that focuses on intersectionality and equity. And all we had to do is just start paying attention to it. So we have to center our work on the people that are most marginalized. And until we lift up everyone, we're really not going to achieve the success that we want.
Wow. Well, I would say you covered it all in about 3 minutes in a very powerful way. That's wonderful. I love the idea of setting the table, because we often talk about getting at the table, but I love the idea of setting the table because it really gets at that idea of valuing, embracing, and respecting all voices. So that's a great way. And we know, though, that this is a journey, right? Changing cultures and changing values and changing systems. Whitney, I want to ask you a little bit about this. So we know that these efforts to bring about change in gender diversity and inclusion have already begun, and that groups like yours, Green 2.0, are pushing mainstream environmental organizations and government agencies and foundations to really recognize their historical lack of diversity, especially among women of color and especially in leadership roles, and that you're working to tackle this issue. We also know the old management adage that what gets measured gets done. So I'm wondering about some of the key metrics that your organization looks at to track these dimensions. And also if you could talk a little bit about some successes and progress that you've seen since you started doing this work.
Absolutely. And thanks for that question. And I'm actually going to lead with a fact that, like, I'm a mother of 2 boys, 2 small children. So Jesse, like you, Sharon, others, like, it's hard, right? And especially in this moment, right, of having 2 small children who I'm supposed to also be teaching, but also taking out into the wilderness, or would love to and can't always right now, which is one of the ways that I'm hoping to, like, continue the legacy of the work that I care about most, but also the work that the world needs most, right? And so I'm raising 2 young men who will hopefully be incredible feminists going forward. But also the other thing I want to raise, Sharon, before I get to your point, is like the range of gender identity too, which is right now we're talking often in binaries, and I'm just going to highlight the fact that there is a range, right, of gender identity that I think we really need to both recognize, but also account for in the decision-making process, right? There are folks who identify as women, there are folks who identify as men, but there are people who identify across that whole spectrum. And we need to also center them in these conversations because it's so important. And, you know, women have also been often marginalized in these conversations and in leadership. And we have to think very intentionally, as Chanté said, about who are you centering, who are you considering, who are you thinking about? And this then goes to what you measure, right? So Green 2.0 has been focused on measuring the demographics, right? The sort of straight numbers, like, you know, how many people of color, how many women do you have? Recognizing that that is a lagging indicator, right? My hope is that an organization is doing work on equity and justice that will bring the people to them so that they will hopefully have 200, 300, like Lisa said, like how many people and how many women are showing up will tell you how well you're actually doing, both as a reputation as an organization, but also in the work that you're doing. but you need to think about both qualitative and quantitative metrics. So some are around the numbers, the data, how are your applicant pools looking? What are your promotion and retention rates? What is your attrition rate for an organization? Do you have attrition rates that are marketably different for people of color versus women, and why, right? But you need to really also understand qualitatively what is happening in your organization as a culture, and then also across the whole field, right? And so when I think about this work at a big picture level across a field, how is the field's culture conducive to women, to people of color, or not? What are we conveying to the world about what conservation is and who does it? And for me, seeing the beginning of those conversations and the people who are both given voice to speak for an organization, to speak for their community, for organizations who are willing to give a platform to a partner in a fundamentally different way, that tells me how committed an organization truly is. If they are truly building equitable partnerships, they are creating those shared values. They are finding ways to work. They are working and saying, like, look, we only need 20% of the finances here because we know you're a smaller organization and we know you need it more, and that's what this looks like. So those are the places where I see it, and when organizations are truly stepping up, is they are giving voice to another community who hasn't had one. And when I see leaders who can talk not only eloquently, but also give their personal stories of where they've made mistakes, of where they've learned, and being truly vulnerable in those moments of saying, I didn't do that well, but here's what I'm going to do differently now. That's when I know an organization has really taken something to heart.
It's great. There's those metrics, like you said, the numbers, the quantifiable numbers, and that there's the importance of how deeply you're actually involving people. And I wonder down the road if there'll be these benchmarks that we can look at, scorecards, if you will, that look at some of those qualitative dimensions as well, which would be great if we could get at some of that when it comes to measurement. Elaine, I was wondering, have we had some questions that we'd like to bring to the panel? I know that we've got a lot of people that are attending today, and we see lots of chat going on in our chat room. How about some questions from our attendees? Oh, we can't hear you, Elaine. How are you doing?
Yes, indeed. We do have quite a few questions, and they're really good questions, several of which they want to hear more personal stories. So one from Christina Gomez. I'm sure many women listening want to know more about your path in your own organization, your personal stories about how you got to where you are and what kind of struggles you went through. And some of you talked about this, and how you overcame them. It's sometimes hard for women to succeed in general, but especially as a woman, and more specifically as a foreign woman of color. So what advice do you have for women who would like to grow in conservation in what's generally a man's world? I think you all spoke to that in some way, but she's asking this question to any panelist who will speak to it and share your personal stories. And a couple of others are looking at those same things. Okay, Purnima.
Yeah, Purnima, yeah, I'd like to tell some of my personal stories, how we brought these women to conservation. I think others will find it very interesting, so that's why I'd like to mention. Like earlier when I started my work, I visited every household and invited the lady of that household, and they denied to come to the meeting. And when we had a meeting, only a few came. They said whenever I went, they liked me, but they said that no, because we have to cook for my husband, we have to take care of the family, we have so many works. And when I see their work, yeah, it's so much huge work they have to do. And all the time they say that we have to cook for my children. So that's why I started with cooking. I started organizing cooking competition in every locality. I selected a locality like this, like 10 household in one locality, then like transact, you know. So then I started doing cooking competitions with them. and they came like anything. And then we had rewards for them, and those cooking competitions were related with the tradition, with the tradition food and all. And then I started, once they came, they found joy. And once they came, I started playing with them web of life, some environment education games, how a species is connected with nature, how a species is connected with another species, human. Like it's like how removal of one species impacts the others, and how Hargila is important. And so it worked a lot, and and they became my friends, and they wanted to come. Then after that, what I started doing, I saw that that when the birds came for breeding and when they laid eggs, people were, just some people just cut down the trees or hit them with the stone, or something wrong happened, or yeah, and the bird got disturbance. So I realized that rather than if we organize a big meeting, conference, seminar, that doesn't work in the community level. So what I started doing, I started inviting every household to come to a stork baby shower, Hargila baby shower. Everyone said, what Hargila baby shower? Yeah, actually, I connected with womenhood, because when I saw some ceremony of a woman, when she was an expecting mother, it really hit me, and I thought that the bird is laying eggs, and we can do some events like this. And it was 12 years back I started this, and the women came like anything, and it was so successful. They thought that it was their own meeting, it was their own, like they celebrate in their own children's birthday or own children's marriage. It was like their own ceremony where I just started this movement, and they participated a lot and got emotionally sensitized. There I could integrate the science also, that, and they gave the hymn that the birds will increase the population. And now I don't need to tell them, do not cut down the trees. They will go and influence their husband, do not disturb the bird, do not cut down the trees. So this way actually I merged the tradition into the conservation, and it worked a lot. We every year we now celebrate Hargila baby shower. I invite everyone next year, and we also do lots of environment education with the women, and also biodiversity, and we and also biodiversity education, and give them looms, yarns, sewing machines. Now in this COVID pandemic time, our women are very busy in preparing face mask with the Hargila in the or in animals, so they are getting income. They are feeling very honored also to be associated with the health issues and all. So these are some the methods how we do. Yeah, I'd love to answer more if any question comes. Yeah.
Thank you, Purnima. That's really sweet.
Thank you.
Yeah, does anyone else on the panel, because this was to all panelists, want to share any story about how you came into conservation and your path, and what advice you would have from your own kind of personal story?
Can I add?
Sure.
Elaine?
Yes, please.
Okay, cool. So I mean, I think I was pretty much one of the lucky ones that, like, when I was, whatever, 2-3 years old, I kind of always knew that I was in love with large mammals and wildlife. And and so I knew I wanted to do that, but it was also not very easy. As as an Egyptian, it's not, and as an Egyptian woman particularly, it's not okay to be working in that space. And I think what I was very fortunate is to have like very supportive family. And I had a very strong grandmother that would just say, you can do whatever you want. You just like put your mind to it and push. And I think like I'm very, I persevere, I push through things. And I think that is something who I am. And getting into the conservation field, I only had male role models, right, in East Africa. And so I started learning how to lead through the way they led. So when I started running our own organization, fortunately I had a co-director, another woman, and she balanced me a lot. because I was hard hitting, I was pushing everyone, and I just thought this is what we needed to do. Like, we're losing lions. Like, you know, I mean, I spent every day picking up lion carcasses. Like, I was like, this is too much. Like, we need to make these changes. So we need to push everybody. And, you know, this idea of like just, you know, not necessarily communicating through everything because it was taking too long. And this is what my role models were showing me how to do. But I just felt really bad every night going to bed. Like, this is not me. And because I had this great, you know, this great colleague that I was running the organization with, she was able to let me just, you know, kept encouraging me, no, do what you think is right. You don't need to follow other people. You just have to be yourself. And so learning what that meant and learning to have, you know, crucial conversations, being compassionate, and just kind of leading the way that made me feel more comfortable. We were much more productive as well. We didn't have as much conflict. And we started like saving lions, where now we have 7 times the number of lions we ever had in the past. It's one of the only growing lion populations in all of Africa. And I think that pride, you know, coming from bringing back pride, like that's our ethos. It's like being able to like be our authentic selves when we lead. And so, and then, you know, I mean, we still persevere through this. And I went through a period of time where I had malaria, I had bouts of scapes at the same time, I had broken leg. Like, you just kind of keep going, you keep going, you keep going. And it's not healthy because we don't take care of ourselves. We get into a place when we work in the field where, you know, we have 75 staff. And so we worry about them, but we don't worry about ourselves. And so then I got really interested in wellness and how to take care of everyone and how do we take care of ourselves, because we tend to not do that as well. And when you're working in these very difficult environments, you know, people get depressed, people get, you know, a lot of physical problems because it's very difficult to bounce up and down in a Land Cruiser for 20 plus years. Like, it's tough on your body. So it's like all these things that we don't think about. We keep thinking, well, we just have to keep going because it's like we're trying to prove ourselves. But when you get to a point where you don't need to do that anymore, you sit back, your perspective changes, and you do conservation much better.
And
I'd like to.
it's noticed by everybody else then too, when you're suddenly in that place of your own self-confidence. Yes.
Elaine, I'd like to raise one other point, which is the paradigm shift that I think you're getting to, which is like the paradigm shift around leadership.
Yes.
Right? Which is like leadership looking fundamentally differently than how sort of our model in conservation has been portrayed for many years, actually frees everybody. And I think this is the thing we need to recognize. It doesn't just free women, it also frees men and others, right? Yes. Which is, what does that paradigm actually need to look like for you? You know, for every individual, leadership is going to look different. And I still remember the moment where I had a boss who didn't understand what my leadership didn't look like the classic leadership, and was like, I don't understand that, you're not leading. And it's like, but my leadership will look different, both because of who I am. And folks need to understand, not only is that valuable, right? But it's actually helping conservation overall, having those different types of leaders, because it also allows everyone to bring their hopefully fuller selves to this work, but it also eliminates covering in a lot of respects. And if you guys don't know about covering, but covering is Kenji Yoshino, a professor out of New York University's law school, has a wonderful, incredible book on covering and how people essentially hide, quote unquote, parts of their lives or themselves. And that really hampers their ability to bring both their knowledge, their innovation, creativity. And so when you break down those barriers for everyone, you actually unleash the full ability in an organization and in a field to transform.
Yeah, wonderful. So true.
Powerful. Elaine, sorry, I think I'm going to have to jump in. I'm just a little keeping an eye on the time there. I want to wrap it up on time. So I wish we could take a lot more questions. We have such a rich conversation going on right now, and I really appreciate all the perspectives that you've all brought to this conversation this morning. Very powerful for me. I want to kind of just end when thinking about the world right now as it stands. We know that we're facing unprecedented environmental challenges like nothing we've seen to date in human history. And, you know, it's a fire drill, and it's clear we've all got to be part of the solution. We've all got to get on board. Yet when we look around, as we've discussed this morning, we see that women and people of color, and especially, I would say, women of color, are not well represented in the conservation movement right now, especially at the senior management and board level. This is, even though all the research tells us that diversity in all its dimensions, as we've talked about, leads to more innovation and better performance for organizations, and I would say, in the case of conservation, better conservation outcomes. We really believe that the conservation movement is made stronger by having more women leaders in that space. So here's my last question to all of you, because we're at the Earth Optimism Summit. We want to end on a note of optimism. Can you tell me, and we'll go around as many as we can, what is the one element you'd introduce or change in the current system that we have in order to catalyze and empower women, all women in conservation, and why? How about we start with you, Chanté?
Oh, sure. So I would increase the level of something, and that is love. I think so often when we go to work, in our homes now, if we're sheltering in place, we feel like we need to leave our humanness at home and leave our emotions at home. And I think we need to embody and really lead from a space of love to build authentic relationships, be empathetic, and understand different experiences. And when we do that, I think we're going to be able to elevate and uplift all people, especially women, to the places where we really need them. So I try to approach my work with a lot of love, and I know it's helped me. So I think we just need more love.
Great, I love it. humane leadership. I think it's the wave of the future. Jessie, would you like to share a few thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think institutionally, I've already mentioned a couple ideas. This support for childcare for those of us, especially who aren't lucky like I am to have an incredibly supportive family that can help me. But I think that we need to change things institutionally for sure. But we can also work outside of our institutions to change things. And so by creating these networks of women, what we're really doing is just bringing women together. And as Purnima has mentioned, as others have mentioned, when women feel supported, they're able to accomplish a lot more. And by forming these networks, you're making connections that introduce women to other women who may have the technical expertise that they need to do something. They may have the academic expertise that they need to do something, to push something forward, to give just any conservation effort that extra little boost that it needs. That can happen through simple networking and connections. We all know about the Boys Club. Well, we need to be making a girls club globally. And with WIN, what we encourage people to do is to set up their own little chapters all over the world. We have Purnima leads a chapter in India. We have chapters in Nepal, in Argentina, and Guyana, and everywhere. We have a great chapter at Michigan State University. So women in graduate school are leading these chapters. Setting up these nodes or these chapters of women, supporting women and connecting them to one another is a fantastic way to support other women working at conservation at all levels, not just at the top, not just to put people in leadership roles. That's really important. But we also need to support the women who are working at all levels in conservation, because we need every single individual to achieve greatness.
That's so true. There's power in the pod, right? There's power in all of us working together. Leela, would you like to say a few words? We've got a little time left on the clock.
Okay, sure. It's hard to pick one thing. I think I could pick like 10 things that I'd like to see change, but if I'm going to pick one, it'd probably be around changing conservation norms. I feel like conservation, there's still a huge lack of diversity and inclusion, particularly at the leadership level. Like, this is what we're seeing in Africa, and I'm sure it is everywhere else too. I think conservation, the old school thinking, it still embraces this kind of mindset of scarcity and blame. That leads to like unproductive competition, little desire to share knowledge or collaborate at all. And we haven't figured out how to provide safe spaces I think this is really critical if we truly want to see this as, you know, the big change. So we need safe spaces so people can be vulnerable. And Whitney, you brought this up because I think that's really, really important. When you feel safe, you can be vulnerable. You can admit failure. And through that, you can grow. You can become more resilient from the failures or lessons learned. So to me, safe spaces encourage like more productive communication, and people become more innovative because you can share without judgment. So to me, that's kind of where I'd like to see change happen.
Great, thank you. So safe spaces, we've got love, we've got support. Purnima, what do you think?
Yeah. So being the best person, this is a message for request for every woman, being the best person of myself, yourself. As I have mentioned that I had to struggle a lot. I think every woman had to struggle a lot. And then when I thought that rather than fighting with a group of men, why don't be the best person of myself, trying to improve myself. And as much as I can, there is no limit. The sky is the limit, and that is my, you know, like mantra. That is, you know, and I also like to mention that I climbed a bamboo platform. It is one bamboo platform is 100 feet and one is 80 feet. I climb and I stay there up to sometimes for 15 days to study the breeding behavior of the bird. And this bamboo platform is so scary. Like every, you know, because I don't have much resource to have a very high tech, so I just make a very, you know, low resource thing. So each bamboo platform's ladder gives me the definition of leadership. I have to go high, I can't see down. My husband, my family supports me a lot. I'm very lucky, you know, for this. But my husband, he can't tolerate it. He thinks that this is a man's job. This is not a woman's job. And even community, they think that this is a man's job. But then when they saw me, they thought, oh my God, we have to support her. If she is a mother of two daughters. I have twin daughters. So communities also. So I think women should lead by example, being the best person of herself, building networks, like Jessie said, Leela said, innovative. I always request everyone to be very innovative, and that is my message. Thanks a lot.
Be the best you can be. That's great advice. We start with ourselves, right? Whitney, could you maybe take us out on this note?
Can I add one more thing, Sharon?
Yes, please.
There are many, many, many questions in the chat and the Q&A. And so if anybody is able to go, even after we say goodbye, respond to any of those questions, I think it would be really helpful because people are really involved with the questioning. It's wonderful.
Okay, great. We'll see who has time afterwards, maybe. So Whitney, let's hear what you think about what would you change, that one thing you think, the lever that could really, if you pulled it, change the systems.
It's a big audacious question, which is you have to like pull the lever of society, right, to really make this change. But I'm gonna go to hyper local and hyper personal, which is radical humility and radical vulnerability. Because I think one of the things people need to realize that change starts with you. And so if you recognize what you know, but also what you don't know, and are explicit about that, and explicit about the times when you do things well, but also times when you don't do things well, and share that with your friends and colleagues, that is the place where you will both grow the most. It'll be uncomfortable, right? But you will come out as a better person, but also help to lead this movement in a fundamentally different way that is required for the challenges we have ahead.
Wow, I have to say I got goosebumps when you started talking about radical humility and radical vulnerability. I think that's really powerful. So, and I think that's a great note to end on. I think we could talk all day, all week about all of these topics. There's so much to unpack. I want to thank you all for taking the time out of your days today to come here and to share your wisdom and your stories and your passion with us. It's been a real inspiring conversation for me. I'm getting a little verklempt. And to our audience, we've had questions about what can I do? I would just like to invite you to maybe have one conversation this week about gender equality, diversity and inclusion, whether it's at home, at work, virtually, obviously, it has to be. Join an affinity group. We've talked a lot about that today. Find your community where you can feel safe and comfortable talking about these things and bringing other people into the conversation who might not normally be a part of that conversation. And to others, be an ally, get involved and get talking. I'm really optimistic that we can make the world a better, brighter, and greener place. And so thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So if anyone had a few minutes to stay on and answer a couple of questions, we'd be happy to field some questions with our participants.
Hey, Sharon, I have to do another session that's just starting, but could you, any questions that are there for me, I would love to answer them. So if there's any way to get them, then I will answer them at some point.
Great.
All right. Thank you guys, everybody. It was so lovely being with you.
Thank you, Lily.
Bye.
Have a great day.
I also have to jump. I dropped my email address in the chat box. If anyone has questions for me, I'd be happy to answer them.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much, Chanté. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you for having me. Nice to see you all.
Bye-bye. How about we take one or two questions? Whitney, are you able to stay for a couple of minutes, or do you have to head out?
I can stay for a minute or two.
How about we do two more questions, Elaine? Two or three more questions?
Yes, actually, there are questions about how do you sensitize your own children? People talked about having their own children, at least 2 or 3 of you did. And how young should you start talking to your children about conservation and get them inspired to be part of this movement?
Start and, birth.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know why there's a limit, right? Like, should be no limit. When I think about both of our children, just taking them out, for walks and things like that, and just exploring just the simple leaves and grass that are like right around them, and the books, especially the early books that we had, did have things around at least just nature to get them just to explore the world around them. But children are natural scientists, right? They are incredibly curious. They want to know what's out there. They want to learn, like literally let them lead. Your job often is to get more out of the way and then to provide them with the resources. And then there are, tons, depending on where you are in the world, camps and other things that also can help children learn about these topics and how trees talk to each other and all these kind of incredible things. But it starts now, like there's no limit from my perspective at all on when you can start talking to your kids about conservation.
Yeah, and I would add to that, encourage questions. And this probably goes without saying for everyone who's listening here, but take the time to answer them or to help them find the answers to them. Because I think that part's really important too.
Yeah, and I think just thinking about, it's not just developing an environmental conscience, but it's actually quite good for kids in terms of health benefits and their development to be out in nature. So there's a lot of benefits to getting kids out in nature early on, and some of the other ways that Jesse and Whitney are talking about in terms of getting them involved in conservation ideals.
And there was another kind of related question that what do you suggest to help the younger woman, like in high school, to start the path to get in a position to be able to participate in any of your programs?
Yeah, so I don't have actually, I would love to hear other people's answers to this, because I just recently ran into kind of a problem of my own. I had a young woman from high school who wanted to come do an internship with us, or wanted to come do a career week or 2 weeks with us. And institutionally, I wasn't allowed to do it because of liability issues, so I couldn't bring her in.
Wow.
So, I want to help, but I don't know how either. So I don't know. Sharon, Purnima, Elaine, Whitney.
I think there are a lot of environmental education programs that I think are doing a great job in this space. There's bio blitzes, citizen science programs. I think like organizations like the Audubon, I know they have great programs where I worked with, I didn't work for the Audubon, but I partnered with them in a program, and they were bringing high school students in to do environmental monitoring, for example. So I think there's a way to kind of connect high school kids to some of these programs, and that sparks that interest and that love, I think, of nature.
Yeah, and Teens Dream and Eco Teen Network. I think those are two major networks that you can get involved in. I just don't know about these things. Purnima, were you going to say something?
That's great.
Yeah, actually, I request all these teen girls to start environment education to begin from their own home first, and then start an eco club. Start an eco club in their school. In their school, they see they can do this. They can take the leadership, and please start bird watching. What are the wildlife found in your surroundings? Because education starts from your own home, from your surroundings. It should not start from a big thing. It should start from a small thing first, and then please you can start your own eco club. You can make a big difference. And I work for NGO Aaranyak. We have internship program. Under my program, Greater Adjutant Stork, we have also started a strong internship program. Very recently, I had my first international intern from USA, Carla Rhodes, and so I request, and maybe one day we'll overcome all this pandemic, and I welcome all these girls to do internship program with us, and I would like to share my email ID. Please be in touch with me. Also, I would like to share, and if I have any suggestions, I would love to share. And the first question, I would like to be very I can't resist myself, like from when we should start our children towards nature. It should just start after birth, actually. And a mother is the best teacher, so that is my message. Thank you.
Yeah, when it comes to like internships and things like that, there's a lot, at least in the United States, and I know across the country, and sometimes you have to look for foundations or nonprofits a little bit sometimes easier than sort of large institutions and the sort of initial phases. But usually organizations are happy to have interns. The only caveat I'll say is for employers, pay your interns. Because that is obviously like one of the barriers to entry. And so if you're going to have an intern, make sure that you pay them, a just and fair wage.
Sorry, I think we're having a little bit of trouble with your audio, Whitney. Can we hear everybody else still?
Yeah, we can.
That's good.
Jesse, I would like to mention something. Can you hear me, please, Jesse?
I can, yeah. And I think Whitney might be back too.
Maybe we can discuss later, but now it just came to the mind that maybe I spoke to Lian also earlier. Maybe these teen girls, this question actually hit me. So maybe we can start some teenage program as a future conservation leader. That would be so powerful. Maybe we can discuss that, and it would be really very strong movement. I think we can do that later. Yeah.
That's great. There are already collaborations coming out of our discussion this morning. Whitney, did you want to add anything to what you were saying? I'm sorry, we lost your audio for a sec there.
No worries. Yeah, just to say, like, you can also create your own internship, so don't be constrained. That's what the world needs.
Yeah, that's great advice. Just get out there and do it, right? How about one more question, Elaine? Oh, I did see the very first question that came in, and I don't know if this person is still with us. It asked that what can people who are not in leadership roles do to improve or enhance representation in this field?
Yes.
I can at least start that one, and then you all can jump in. One is, like, if you're ever on a hiring panel or get on a hiring panel is one way. If you're ever in a position to hire people, ask those hard questions around, what does our applicant pool look like? Who are we asking these questions of, and consistency? And also, like, what have our applicants pools been in the history of the institution? Simple things like that. But also, every person who works for an organization is the ambassador thereof. And so also, you are, quote unquote, always recruiting. One of the best search firms I know is like, you are never not recruiting, even if you are not the person who is the hiring right? Who does the hiring or the hiring manager, but how are you talking about your organization? How are you engaging other groups and communities to which you are a part, or ones that you haven't tapped into yet? How are you expanding your own networks to then bring those further and further into the organization, or at least make them more aware of the work that you're doing? And so that's an easy way, which is like you can always do it every day.
That's great. Great advice. Jessie, did you want to add anything?
Everything that came up in my mind, Whitney, it and beyond. So yeah,
Good at that.
just constant support for those around you, and that we help lift each other up. So that's
Yeah.
Also on the questions, there are many, many responses saying, thank you for such incredible presentation, and people are wanting to enroll with you in this. So collaboration has expanded tremendously.
That's wonderful. I think that's a wonderful note to end this on, guys. Thank you all, or ladies, women, I should say. Thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate it. Thanks to all our participants. A lot of you have stuck with us right up till the end, so we really appreciate it. And we hope this is the beginning of many conversations that we have around these really important issues, both for conservation, but also for the world. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody. Hi, Mama.
Yeah.
Bye.